Good afternoon. We're going to continue talking about the space program. I am talking to my students. Let's start with the U.S. Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program. In 1958, we talked about NASA was created in response to the Soviet Sputnik series, 1958. In 1958, we also launched our first unmanned spacecraft, which is Explorer 1. After that, action picked up extremely quickly, and we wanted to get into Project Mercury, which is a manned flight because we lost the space race. Russia was able to put a man in space prior to us. So NASA picked 7 astronauts and called the name of the project Mercury. Please write that down. Mercury. Very important. Mercury was the first U.S. manned program, and each mission included a single astronaut. These are the 7 astronauts. Know their names. We'll talk about them, and I'll give you specifics on them later on. Also know what a suborbital flight is and an orbital flight. Suborbital is a flight that makes less than one revolution around the Earth. Okay? Orbital flight is a full revolution around the Earth, at least one. So a suborbital flight, one that does not make a revolution or not a full revolution, and an orbital flight is a flight that made a full revolution. In 15 May 1963, one of the astronauts, Cooper, made Project Mercury's sixth and final flight, and he orbited the Earth 22 times in 34 hours. What Mercury did was prove that we could put a man into space and that he could orbit Earth. Here are the first astronauts, true histories in America. Alan Shepard, Virgil Grissom, John Glenn, who was the most famous probably of them all, Scott Carpenter, Walter Schirra, L. Gordon Cooper, who was an Air Force pilot, by the way, Major Don Slayton, also an Air Force pilot. And that takes us to Project Gemini. Project Gemini has had 2 goals. Please remember these. One, it was to keep a man in space for 2 weeks. And the other goal was to dock with another vehicle in space and then be able to re-enter Earth's atmosphere smoothly. Between 65 and 66, it made 10 successful launches. And then in 65, Ed White made the first spacewalk by an American. Please remember that. Ed White was the astronaut that made the first spacewalk by an American. Then we moved to Apollo, and Apollo's purpose was actually to land a man on the moon. We were getting more and more ambitious. Please remember that. Project Apollo's mission was to put a man on the moon. This actually occurred on 20 July 1969. The flight was Apollo 11. The Apollo 11, again, was the first mission to successfully land on the moon. The first person to walk on the moon was Neil Armstrong, but the second was Buzz Aldrin. Please remember those 2 names. Buzz Aldrin was second, and Neil Armstrong was first. We had some disasters. Every mission was not successful. Apollo 1, we had 3 astronauts die. And also on Apollo 13, we had a fire and malfunctions in the capsule. But due to the quick thinking of the astronauts and NASA, they were able to get those young men home safely. Now let's go ahead and walk over to the Soviet side. In the early years of the Soviet space program, they were slightly ahead of us, and they put their first person in space prior to we did. They had their first person in space on 12 April 1961, and the name of the young man was Yuri Gagarin, and he was a cosmonaut. Please write that down. A cosmonaut is a Soviet or Russian astronaut. Let's talk about the key steps in the development of aircraft. Three of the most important terms in space missions are rocket, missile, and launch vehicle. Please remember those terms. A rocket shoots into the air when fuel burns and releases gases that propel it. Uh, Rockets are what moved all of the space capsules into space. A rocket tipped with a bomb is called a missile, and a rocket tipped with a Project Gemini or other mission capsule is called a launch vehicle. So again, rockets are very important because it's what moves. It has the power to move missiles, bombs, or mission capsules into orbit. There are two types of launch vehicles, expendable and reusable. An expendable launch vehicle is used just once. A reusable launch vehicle can be used again and again. And that's what we have moved towards in the space shuttle program. And it's what Colonel Pales flew in when he went to space, the space shuttle, the 1985 Challenger mission. Let's talk about some of the different launch vehicles. The U.S. Air Force used Atlas rockets, and NASA later tipped its Titan II rockets with Gemini capsules for manned orbit flight. So what's important to remember is NASA tipped its Titan II rockets with Gemini capsules, and that's what we used for orbital flight. And if you remember, orbital means that it traveled completely around the Earth. Here are some pictures of the United States launch vehicles, starting with the Scout, going all the way up to the Saturn V. If you ever get a chance to go to NASA, and this is 110 meters, which is over 330 feet long. Now, if you ever get a chance to go to NASA, all of these are displayed there, and this Saturn V is an absolute monster. It's huge. These are the Soviet launch vehicles. If you notice, much smaller than what we used. Key U.S., Soviet, and other satellites. A satellite is an object that orbits a larger object in space. The moon is Earth's satellite. Other planets such as Jupiter and Saturn also have satellites or moons. Those are natural satellites. But what I want to really talk about are man-made satellites. And we have four kinds. Please know these. They're communication, navigation, observation, and scientific. Those are the four types of satellites that the United States employs. Communication satellites are how we speak to one another. Communication navigation satellites are used for navigation, help guide aircraft, help guide submarines. The United States military relies on military radio signals that are sent by satellite. As a matter of fact, most military members during Desert Storm used navigation satellites to move throughout the desert. Because if you can imagine, the desert looks the same almost everywhere. So we really needed the navigation satellites to be able to move and know where we were, but also to know where the enemy was and how to come in contact with the enemy. It helped precisely determines position, speed, and time, which is what truly helped us a lot. The last thing that I want to talk about are the three uh, astronauts that were on the Apollo 11 mission. Very important to our history, very important to the space program. The first is Neil Armstrong. Again, that was the first man on the moon. Um, he was the student, had to, um, he could fly before he learned how to drive a car. Um, First man to walk on the moon. He made a phenomenal statement. He said this was a leap for mankind to get on the moon, and it was. Secondly was Colonel Edwin Buzz Aldrin. He was not only an astronaut, he was a scholar, uh, pilot with the United States Air Force, which makes me a little bit biased. And but he was the second man to walk on the moon. And then an astronaut that not a lot of people speak of is Lieutenant Colonel Michael Collins, and he was the person that he was alone, and he stayed in orbit around the moon while the astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin docked onto the moon's surface, did the experiments that they did, gone back, docked with him, and then uh, they came back to Earth safely. So awesome things. We have an astronaut in our program. Make sure that you ask any questions uh, as we go through this space, as we talk about the space program. Thank you very much.